maybe we can share it for our Australian fellows who cannot be here. I just want to tell that this is something that we have organized together with the University of Memphis, but also with the Center for Knowledge and Cognition of the University of Bologna, and we have Luisa Lugli here. She's a colleague, she's the director of the center, and also for the PhD programs of the universities that are connected with the International Center for Enactivism and Cognitive Semiotics.
Claudio,
so Shaun, thank you very much for accepted to start the series of the seminar. You're going to talk on a special topic for all of us, which is empathy, but this idea, music first, narrative later. Many of us worked on narratives, and the idea also of music connected to primary intersubjectivity that comes from Colwyn Trevarthen work, who inspires us, all of us. It's very important, so we can't wait to listen to you. So thank you very much, Shaun, and thank you to everybody for being here.
Okay, well, thank you, Claudio. And thanks for everyone gathering for this first meeting, and hopefully we will continue as a series of meetings. I think we have some lined up for the rest of the few months. Okay, so I'm going to talk specifically about empathy, and the title here is Music First, Narrative Later, and I think I'll try to make sense out of that title as we go on. So here's a brief outline. This first part, I'll be looking at debates about the notion of empathy and how people define it and understand it. This section is a little bit longer than I would like it to be, but I think it's something like a central background to the kind of claims I want to make later. One claim being about Colwyn Trevarthen's work on what he calls sympathy and what I'll call basic empathy. And I think that Trevarthen gives us a real alternative way of understanding what basic empathy is. He introduces a certain conception that also allows us to think that there might be a continuity between basic empathy and something more higher order, a kind of higher order empathy. But I'm going to take issue with that, and I'm going to argue that what he calls the musicality involved in basic empathy, I'll argue is not really involved with narrative, or narrative is not involved with that. So we'll come to that towards the end. Okay, so on these debates about empathy, I think there is a general contemporary agreement that there are two forms of empathy, variously termed lower order versus higher order, as Alvin Goldman has it, or basic versus reconstructive empathy, as Karsten Stuber puts it, or what Iso Kern calls pre-reflective versus reflective empathy. So even if there's a consensus there, it also turns out that that's the end of any consensus, the end of any agreement. Everything else is under debate and up for grabs in terms of trying to sort out what people really mean by empathy. So there are different theories of what constitutes basic empathy, and different theories of what constitutes higher order empathy, and different theories of how basic empathy relates to higher order empathy. And these debates span over 100 years. There were debates that took place in the early 20th century, and there are more recent debates taking place in the beginning of this century. The early 20th century disputes about basic empathy circle around the concept of Einfühlen that Theodor Lips proposed, and also some criticisms leveled against Lips by the phenomenologists. And I think because these disputes are in some ways repeated in similar terms in more recent debates, I'm going to really focus on the contemporary discussion with some references back to the earlier debate. The contemporary debate in philosophy of mind and cognitive science primarily involves two schools of thought, the simulationists and the phenomenologists. So I'll talk first of all about a simulation approach to empathy. So generally speaking, simulation involves imaginatively placing ourselves in the shoes of the other person and asking what we would do in her situation. Simulation is considered a form of empathy, where, as Alvin Goldman puts it, the term empathize is roughly equivalent to simulate in an intersubjective fashion. Now, much of the recent debate has been motivated in part by the neuroscience of mirror neurons. So once we started to talk about mirror neurons, we started to get a really interesting perspective on the very idea of empathy. Simulationists claim that the activation of mirror neurons constitute a form of simulation. Activation of mirror neurons simulate or match in one's own motor system the other person's action or emotion. And Vittorio, of course, is probably the most well-known proponent of this view. I think this view is close to Theodor Lips' earlier account that we experience and not just imagine the same thing that the other person experiences, and that the other person's experience is in some way resonating in us, or that we engage in a kind of automatic imitation of what they are experiencing. As Fabri Destro and Rizzolatti put it, this mechanism, they're talking here about mirror neurons, this mechanism transforms observed emotional situations into visceral motor responses analogous to those that are present when an individual actually experiences these emotions. This emotional mirror system gives the observer a direct feeling of what others feel. So the emphasis here is on having the same experience that the other person has. So Vittorio presents what I think may be the clearest statement of this theory. He distinguishes between the subpersonal activation of mirror neurons, the functional level, which is characterized as simulation, and the experiential level, which provides, as he puts it, the sense of similarity that we experience anytime we confront ourselves with other human beings. It could be defined also as the empathic level. So mirror neurons, simulation, empathy, these are sort of different level descriptions of the same phenomenon. So in this view, basic empathy may be ubiquitous in our intersubjective relations, since mirror neurons activate automatically whenever we see others' intentional actions or their expressions of emotion. Now, in contrast, phenomenologists in both the contemporary debate and the earlier one, they take issue with the claim that basic empathy reduces to an automatic activation of the motor system. So in the earlier debate, Husserl and Edith Stein, for example, offered a critique of Lips on this point. More recently, Zahavi has sort of taken up this phenomenological perspective, and he would say something like automatic resonance really is a kind of contagion rather than a kind of empathy. He would also say it's just not necessary to match or to simulate anger in my own system in order to grasp the fact that the other person is angry. In grasping that another person is angry, we do not necessarily feel anger ourselves. And if we see that someone else is fearful, we don't empathize by experiencing fear ourselves. And this is repeating basically a point made by Husserl much earlier. So according to the phenomenologists, basic empathy involves perception rather than simulation or any kind of imagination. So for Husserl, empathy is a complex form of perception that involves a representation. The German term here is Vergegenwärtigung, which is difficult to translate. We might translate it as representation or maybe re-enactment, which pairs the other's embodied actions to my own experienced embodied actions. So to the extent that I grasp their intentions and emotions in this perceptual way, that just is what phenomenologists call empathy. And they want to say that this is not automatic, and therefore empathy is not so ubiquitous. On a variation of this account, it's a matter of direct perception. I can attune to others' intentions and emotions on the basis of what I perceive of their behaviors and bodily expressions, which at least in part constitute their intentions and emotions. What I can see of them, those expressions, in fact, are part of what I would define as their intention or as their emotion. Okay, we can also, I believe, add to this phenomenological account and think of perception as inactive here. And that itself could involve the activation of the mirror system, but understood in a kind of non-simulationist interpretation of that kind of activation. So perception as inactive is sensory motor, mirror neuron activation may be involved in this kind of perception, and that would be slightly different from a simulationist account of mirror neuron activation. Okay, so much for basic empathy. There are also debates and similar kinds of debates about higher order empathy. So there is a similar opposition between simulationists and phenomenologists that concern this notion of higher order empathy. So there are some simulationists, and here I'm thinking about Pierre Jacob, Frédéric Devenimont, their work with Tanya Singer on empathy. They take a simulationist perspective, but they regard the mirror neuron account of basic empathy to be more like an account of mind reading. And they think that empathy is more complex than that. So this higher order complex empathy is what they are concerned to describe. And these thinkers define a set of collectively sufficient conditions for what they would be calling higher order empathy. And here are the conditions as they outline them. The first is what they call the affectivity condition, which would state that there is no empathy unless both target and empathizer experience some affective state. And they think this distinguishes it from a kind of standard mind reading. The second condition is what they call the interpersonal similarity condition, ISC, which would say that there is no empathy unless the targets and the empathizer's affective states stand in a similarity relation to each other, which means that the affective states have to match or be isomorphic. So both people have to be experiencing pain or both experiencing fear. The third condition is the vicarious state condition. So the empathic state involves an as-if or vicarious affective state, generated by the empathizer's imaginative portrayal of another person's affective state. Their primary example here is pain, so it might be that their example is really suggesting this particular condition. A fourth is the ascription condition. There's no empathic understanding unless the empathizer knowingly ascribes the affective state to the target, and this distinguishes empathy from contagion. And finally, they add the caring condition. The empathizer must be led to care about the target's affective life because of some context. Okay, there's a lot to say about all of these different conditions. I'm not going to try to give you any fuller account, except I will say just a couple things about the interpersonal similarity condition. So this second condition, first of all, it helps to distinguish empathy from sympathy. There's always long-standing confusions about what empathy is as opposed to sympathy, and different people define these things differently. But this second principle is pretty good in this respect. So it would say that empathy means being in the same or similar affective state as the other person, where sympathy would mean being in different affective states. So for example, I could feel sorry that you are in pain. I don't feel pain, but I feel sorry. That would be a kind of empathy. A second point is simply what Pierre Jacob claims about this condition. So he says of this condition that it is arguably the major assumption of the simulation-based approach to empathy. So this condition apparently is quite central to their account of what constitutes higher order empathy. So again, with respect to this particular condition, we can ask a question. What aspect of the affective state needs to match or be isomorphic? And I think there are at least two possibilities. And the simulationists take up one possibility, and I think the phenomenologists take up a different possibility. So I think for the simulationists here, they're talking about the phenomenality of the state, the feeling itself of anger, which would be different from, say, the feeling of worry. All right, that phenomenal aspect of the affective state is what they think should match. The phenomenologists, however, would suggest that this other aspect, which is the intentionality of the state, might be important. This is the fact that a particular emotion is about something, about a particular context or circumstance. So on the phenomenological view, empathy, we might say, involves a kind of co-intentionality, where there's a shared understanding of the other person's situation. And the central point here is that it's about the intentionality of the of the affective states involved. So for example, I might be sad or angry about an injustice that was done to my friend. So would that still be empathy if my friend were like sad or angry about something entirely different, some other event that occurred in their life? Or what if I'm angry, what if what I'm angry about is not the same as what my friend is angry about? Then one could claim on that score that our affective states are not the same or isomorphic, since there's a difference, at least, in terms of the intentionality. And it also seems possible that even some phenomenally non-similar affective states may be sufficient for empathy if there is co-intentionality. So, for example, if I'm outraged, but I'm not sad, I'm just outraged about the injustice done to my friend, knowing that she is simply sad, but doesn't feel outraged herself about the injustice, it would be odd, I think, to claim that I'm not empathizing with her, even though our affective states are, well, phenomenally different. So I think important for empathy, the emphasis on intentionality at least highlights the significance of understanding the situation or circumstance of the other person, and not just her internal affective state. And, one further thing to note is that even if the phenomenal and the intentional aspects of our affective states line up, they will never be perfectly isomorphic, since in this case, I'm feeling empathy or kind of empathic anger, let's say, and my friend is experiencing real anger and is not experiencing empathy. So if we take empathy itself to be a kind of feeling or a kind of emotional state, added to whatever state that I might be experiencing, then in that sense, there's not going to be an isomorphism. Iso Kern develops a phenomenological view of empathy consistent with the emphasis on intentionality. So higher order empathy involves a reflective, imaginative representation or reenactment, there's that word again, the Vergegenwärtigung, a reenactment of the other's perspective. According to Kern, one imaginatively puts oneself into the perceptual, emotive, and volitional point of view of the other living being, and imaginatively represents how the world feels from that perspective. So he emphasizes that empathy is a situated social act and is directed at the situation rather than at just the other person or the other person's mental state. And in addition, Karen emphasizes that empathy includes a tendency of taking an action, he says, or what Nico Frija has called the action tendency of an emotion. So empathy involves this kind of action tendency as well. And the example Karen gives is if I see a child in danger of falling into a well, my empathy includes, quote, the tendency to hold him back from falling in or to get him out if he has already fallen into the well. So this action tendency is intrinsic to empathy, according to Karen. Okay, so you can see that both the simulationist and phenomenological accounts of higher order empathy rely on the use of the imagination. This appeal to imagination in both accounts, however, is open to the following objection, which is what I call the diversity problem elsewhere. So if imagination is a way of putting myself into the other person's shoes, if the other person is wearing shoes even, or if it means that I project myself into the other person's situation, then what I understand is what I would feel in that situation and not necessarily what the other person would feel. This is an objection that has been raised by a number of people, including Max Scheler a long time ago, Gilbert Ryle, mid-20th century, in response to a position called inference from analogy, which is a kind of forerunner to the simulationist view. So specifically, if, as simulation theory suggests, I consult my own experience and on that basis imagine what it must be like for the other person, it's quite possible that my own experience is so narrow or so different that I don't actually reach a sense of what the other's experience is like. So I may understand what I would do in that situation, but that doesn't help me understand what the other person would do. That same objection has been raised against Karen's phenomenological account. So Zita Luo, for example, writes, on Karen's interpretation, if empathy is in essence rooted in imagination by means of imaginatively putting oneself into the other's position, then it will ultimately result in a substitution of the other's perspective with one's own. Now, Luo returns to Husserl's view that empathy is a special kind of perception rather than imagination, although it's not really clear that this would be something that will apply to higher order empathy rather than to basic empathy, so I'm going to set that aside. One last perspective on this is what we might call a hermeneutical account based on a notion of narrative practices. And this is an account that I've put forward myself, an account of higher order empathy. According to this view, we start to develop narrative competency relatively early when a child's capacity for pro-social behavior or higher order empathy starts to emerge. Now, of course, there's somewhat of a debate about when exactly this takes place. Jean Decety, for example, proposes that it's around 2 years of age. You start to see pro-social behavior, at least at that time. And then others from different perspectives. In a sense, the problem is that everybody's kind of defining empathy in a different way. So the range is from 2 to 3 to 4 years of age. I don't think we have to decide that here, but it's still, we could still say that somehow or other narrative competency develops over a certain number of years in childhood, and along with that we get a kind of development of empathic behavior. So this hermeneutical account also depends upon imagination, but it depends upon what I've called narrative imagination or imagination, in contrast to what Goldman has called enactive imagination, which I would prefer to call simulative imagination, just so that we don't get too confused. In any case, in the case of narrative imagination, I imagine the other person's situation rather than her mental state. And I imagine it by drawing on a rich and diverse store of narratives that are derived not just from my own narrow set of personal experiences, but from a vast variety of resources contained in cultural narratives, including bedtime stories, fairy tales, novels, movies, theater, television, so forth, and so on. So this is a view that I've developed along with Dan Hutto in this case. So the idea is that through my exposure to narratives of all sorts, I gain an openness to understanding another's life story and to understanding her experience in her context. And on this view, basic empathy and higher order empathy may be causally and reciprocally related in some way. So we might, for example, say that higher order empathy may depend in some way on basic empathy, so that some understanding of a person's context may not even elicit a higher order empathic response unless there's some form of basic empathy already in play. Or on the other hand, understanding the other's context or story can modulate or even generate more basic empathic processes, which sometimes happens, let's say, for example, when we're reading a novel or viewing a film. Basic empathy and higher order empathy may be somewhat integrated processes, and it's not always easy to distinguish them. Okay. So that's basically a kind of longish review of some of the debates, some of the differences of approaches to the whole question of empathy. In this second part, I want to focus on Colwyn Trevarthen's view on what he calls sympathy. So he cites the views of Adam Smith and Charles Darwin, who consider sympathy to be a human innate capacity serving processes of social and moral relationships, including cooperation and communication. Trevarthen emphasizes the role of what Stern has called vitality dynamics as contributing to these kinds of empathic process or sympathic processes. And he cites his own research with Stephen Malloch on what they call communicative musicality, which is involved in proto-conversations between infants and caregivers. So Trevarthen and Malloch's suggestion is that the musical communicative movement, so the ideas of kind of rhythmic communicative movements involved in vocal exchanges, is organized as a kind of joint narrative between the mother and her infant. This musical narrative organization underpins a mutual sympathetic emotion regulation, which becomes the foundation of later developing communicative processes via language. So in this view, communicative movement involves the weaving of a coherent musical narrative with well-defined or deliberate motor affective phases, which they map out, and call introduction, development, climax, and resolution. So this type of movement that they are describing and this type of interaction they're describing goes through this type of structure. So the theoretical inclination here is to see movement as a kind of natural language, structured in phases of arousal and focused intensity, resulting in the communication of meaning. On their view, narrative structure is there from the beginning. It has an inborn organization, originating very early, as they put it, in the earliest explorations of action by the human fetus in utero. Trevarthen specifies narrative as involving what he calls propositional sequences in the form of postural modifications, hand gestures, oriented movements of the head, the eyes, and facial expression. These are all embodied type movements, which may all be modulated by emotion in a process where the infant, Trevarthen says, tells a story as it interacts sympathetically with the mother. Trevarthen uses the term sympathy rather than empathy for this phenomenon. He's following Adam Smith on this. And he makes a point of distinguishing sympathy from empathy. So for him, sympathy is just this reciprocal sharing in the appropriate timing and emotional response of the shared movement between people. And empathy, he thinks, well, he doesn't like the word empathy. He thinks, well, that's Tishner's translation of Lips's term, Einfühlung, and it's been associated, he thinks, too much with the mind reading and a theory of mind approaches to social cognition. So he sets that term aside and focuses on what he calls sympathy. One problem, he admits, is that sympathy has come to signify something akin to simply pity or feeling sad for someone. And this is not what Trevarthen means by sympathy, and it's not the concept that we want in this context. We have to say that both terms, sympathy and empathy, are problematic insofar as they have taken on meanings that did not necessarily belong to them originally. All right. I'm going to decide here to stay with the term of art, empathy, and specifically I'll take Trevarthen to be offering a characterization of basic empathy. All right. What he calls sympathy is what I think is basic empathy. But what I'm going to suggest is that it is clearly an alternative conception to anything that we've discussed in the earlier or contemporary debates. So my claim is not only that Trevarthen offers us an alternative way of thinking about basic empathy, but also suggests a way to see a real continuity between basic empathy and higher order empathy. So I'm going to outline his alternative conception and endorse it, as I think it is an enactivist account that he's giving here, but I'm going to also raise an objection to the principle that seems to ground the idea of continuity for him. So the alternative. Trevarthen's account, I think, best fits into the debate about basic empathy, as I've said. And I think it's an enactive account rather than a simulationist account or a phenomenological account, because empathy is embodied in the movement and in the intersubjective interaction. That's the central point that Trevarthen is making. This empathy, or what he calls sympathy, is embodied in the movement and in the intersubjective interaction. Now, although both the simulationists and the phenomenologists will make claims about the embodied nature of their account, Vittorio Gallese talks about embodied simulation, right? Phenomenologists reference the lived body and an embodied pairing of self and other. All that is well and good. Trevarthen, I think, gives bodily movement and interaction a primary place. The actual bodily movement and the interaction that takes place between the people. So really, he's talking about primary intersubjectivity here. When he describes sympathy, it's really about the intersubjective relations that are sensory motor and bodily from the very start, extending back to neonatal and perhaps prenatal symbiotic, sympathic movement. Empathy in this case is not a simulating neural resonance in the brain of the observer, or even a resonance of the individual perceiver's lived body, as the phenomenologist would say. It's rather something that is already intersubjectively relational, or to use Merleau-Ponty's term, intercorporeal. It's an embodied intersubjectivity in action, we might say. And as Trevarthen describes it, it's a kind of music, improvised, in an active engagement of one person with another. I want to say that on Trevarthen's account, basic empathy is intersubjectively relational. What does that mean? Well, consider an objection that phenomenologists, and specifically here, Dan Zahavi and Shaun Overgaard, have raised against the simulationist interpersonal similarity condition, right? So Jacob and Devignemont and Singer's notion of interpersonal similarity condition. They object to that, which is the idea that there has to be an isomorphism of affective states, which we discussed. So here's their objection. They say, if a person A feels sad for his friend B because of some injustice done to her, but B feels angry about it, then according to the ASC, this would be a case of sympathy, but not empathy, since A and B are in different affective states. If, however, B starts to feel sad about the injustice, then ASC would lead to a recategorization of A's feeling, and it would be called empathy. Well, Zahavi and Overgaard point out that this doesn't make a lot of sense. It's a timer, right? Because A is in exactly the same affective state, whether B is angry or sad. So it would be odd, they think, to say that A is empathizing in one case, but not empathizing in the other, since the only change that really has taken place is in B, right? A hasn't changed at all. So how can it be a change in A from sympathy to empathy or whatever? So that's their objection. This objection, however, makes the same assumption that the simulationists make, that empathy is something like a mental state that belongs to one individual. So in contrast, if we think of empathy as an intersubjective relational phenomenon, the recategorization makes perfect sense, because what changes is not just B or A. What changes is the relation. And I think this is just what Trevarthen's account allows us to say. Empathy is not defined as simply an individual's internal mental or affective state in isolation from the other. It's rather an active, embodied, situated engagement with the other person. It involves the situation or the ongoing fusion or meshing of horizons here. I could bring Gadamer into this, but I'm not going to. But this I think is something then that makes Trevarthen's account quite different from the other accounts that we've seen. So accordingly, rather than simulation of the other's actions or emotions, and rather than just a perception of the other's lived body, basic empathy is a bodily engagement with the other, improvised in the musical give and take of movement, in the postural modifications, hand gestures, oriented movements of the head, eyes, and facial expressions that Trevarthen describes. And as Trevarthen maintains, this enacts meaning, just in the way that social interaction enacts meaning that goes beyond what any individual participant would contribute. So I think this is very much in line with an enactive account. Okay, the last part here is something like an objection that I want to make, and it has to do with, in general, it has to do with the question of continuity between basic and higher order empathy. So what I'm proposing is that the account I just gave is Trevarthen's account, and it's an account of Einfühlung, basic empathy, which is embodied, sensory motor, musical, if you want, interaction. But I want to take issue with Trevarthen's claim that musical empathic movement has a narrative structure or nature. So if Dan Hutto is here, I think he would be aligned on this point. I think Claudio might have a problem with it, but we can discuss this as we go. So first, let me acknowledge that Trevarthen's view is attractive, even on its own, perhaps, but also because it provides a way to think about the continuity between basic empathy and higher order empathy. In other words, if we accept the idea that higher order empathy depends on narrative competency, which would be the hermeneutical view, and if basic empathy is already a form of narrative, as Trevarthen wants it, which is carried over into linguistic communication, then higher order empathy simply continues that process, scales up the narrative, we might say, turns up the music. And this is, I think, implicit in what Trevarthen, along with Delafield-Butt, suggests. They write, the appetite for sharing a narrative is clearly demonstrated by the powers of infants to both imitate expressive movements and collaborate in their sequencing to tell a story, even within hours of birth. There is a remarkable consistency in the performance and emotional regulation of narratives in development at every stage. In simple self-produced intentions of fetal movement, in intersubjective inventions of imitation with a neonate, in early proto-conversations and collaborative play of older infants, in the inventive talk of toddlers and adults, and in effective practice, the effective practice of teaching. All right, so this scales up quite readily if it's all already narrative. The real story, however, I think, is and the central part of Trevarthen's view that I like, is that embodied activities have social meanings. They take on social meanings and significance if they are appropriately situated in intersubjective contexts. So consider the well-known example of how pointing behavior emerges around the age of 9 months in human children. This is Vygotsky's analysis, right? And the idea is that the infant starts out by reaching for something that it wants, a toy or whatever, but that because they cannot reach it and maybe are getting upset, the caregiver will come along and give it to the child. So what starts out as a kind of instrumental, goal-directed, embodied action on the part of the child is transformed into an expressive communication in the intersubjective context. This is to say, what happens is now instead of reaching to grab the thing that it gets to know that it cannot reach, it starts pointing around 9 months of age. That reaching gets transformed into a kind of pointing, but only because the whole thing happened, the whole transition happens within a communicative and intersubjective context where the other person, has to get involved. Okay, I think that's all well and good. Trevarthen's additional claim, however, is that the movement involved in basic empathic intersubjective relations has a narrative structure. And the structure that Trevarthen points to, the structure of introduction, development, climax, and resolution, surely looks like the structure of narrative. It's the same fourfold structure found in semiotic accounts of narrative, where There's talk of contract, competence, performance, and sanction. These are stages that are taken to constitute the canonical structure of all narratives, for example, in semiotics. And here, Claudio, I think, has said something like this. The precise claim made by Trevarthen and colleagues is that the movement of basic empathic intersubjective relations, in this movement, there is an intrinsic narrative structure, an embodied narrative dynamics that is independent of and that pre-exists any structure that might be supplied by narratives of a more conventional sort, which depict such activities and interactions which represent them. We should be concerned, however, about getting this story straight. Should we say that movements and actions have a narrative structure, or should we say that narratives inherit the structure of the actions that they represent? So is action structure intrinsically narratival, or does narrative structure derive from action? I think there's a difference here. To think that movement has an intrinsic narratival structure implies a problematic pan-narrativism, and this is something that I've argued along with Dan Hutto on. If movement is narratival, then everything we do is a narrative. Galen Strawson, who is no friend of narrative, but nonetheless, Strawson suggests that the narrativist view becomes trivially true, a kind of unhelpful and uninformative stipulation. If, for example, one holds, and this is his example, one holds that making coffee is a narrative that involves narrativity because you have to think ahead and do things in the right order. And Strawson says, well, if making coffee is a narrative, everything's a narrative. And then, you know, what's the use of saying that? So more generally, narratologists are motivated to put some limits on the notion of narrative. This is David Herman. He says they want to give a principled account of what makes a text, discourse, film, or other artifact a narrative. Such an account would help clarify what distinguishes a narrative from an exchange of greetings or a recipe for salad dressing or a railway timetable or making coffee. On one view, then, narratives are considered representations that describe or depict a series of events meaningfully related over time in ways that are not captured in purely logical or formal terms. So that's a possible definition of narrative. Greg Curry takes up this definition, and he would say narratives are the means by which someone communicates a story to someone else. Narratives represent their stories. So Greg Curry argues that narratives just don't occur anywhere in nature, right? His suggestion is rather that narratives represent actions or events that themselves are not intrinsically narratives. In representing some action, the narrative can take on the structure of that represented action. And whether one accepts the precise terms of this characterization or not, I think at the very least, narratives can be said, as Ryan puts it, said to constitute a fuzzy set, allowing variable degrees of membership, but centered on a prototypical set of cases that everybody recognizes as stories. So narratives should not be equated with everything and anything. Thinking of narratives as representational artifacts avoids the concern and the concern that the concept of narrative is so loose that narratives wind up being found everywhere, which would be a form of pan-narrativism, where all things are trivially narrative in nature. So we want to say that narrative structure derives from action, but not vice versa. It is, of course, possible to impose a narrative structure or a narrative function onto our actions and make our movements tell a story, as we see, for example, a mime or an actor might do. But such actions are not intrinsically narratives, and not even miming or theatrical performance are intrinsically narratives, given that they imply a third-person audience or observer in order to see, so to speak, the story. So what does this mean for the concept of empathy? To deny that narrative structure is inherent in the praxis of social interaction, even before it achieves linguistic expression, which is what Jerome Bruner had suggested, to deny that, which is to deny a continuity between basic empathy and higher order empathy on the common ground of narrative, is not to deny a continuity that is clearly based on the continuing role of primary intersubjectivity, the music of intersubjective relations that extends throughout the lifespan. Right? This music that Trevarthen describes is not just found in infancy, it's something that we engage in throughout our lives, in our communicative and intersubjective interactions. Right? So we can say that a higher order empathy that would be based on narrative imagination builds on primary and secondary interaction, right? Which is what gives us a basic empathy, this intersubjective interaction, which may also involve an active perception, and we can get mirror neurons into the story as well in terms of understanding what an active perception is. And I think this view allows us to recognize the important role of primary and secondary intersubjectivities in the emergence of narrative capacity at whatever, 2 to 4 years of age, when children begin to manifest prosocial behavior, higher order empathy. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Shaun. Now an applause would be perfect, but
that's okay.
Still, we have to work on that. We can have a record of an applause. So thank you to Lambros, Vittorio, Dan to show up and to have a discussion. There are already some questions. Just one quick word. I think that Shaun has perfectly introduced the core business of our center in some way. So a little bit of the splitting up between a more inactive point of view and a more cognitive semiotics point of view, that things that maybe narrative shape experience in some way, and you can find it also in primary intersubjectivity, or at least in secondary intersubjectivity, and much more idea connected to narrative as a representational artifact, as Dan usually teaches us. So the discussion is open. It's a gorgeous presentation. So Shaun, thanks a lot for that, because it was it makes perfectly the job that we were asking you in order to introduce the International Center. I also want to thank all the people, the audience, because we were more than 100 all during Shaun's presentation. So it's a lot of people. So since it's our first event, I think it's a huge success, and we can be proud of that. So thank you very much. I think that the first one was Gary, that Gary Del Conte, that asked for speaking. Now I'm going to give Gary the words. Then I have Vittorio, then Lambros, Stavros, John, and Susanna. So I'm going to give the word to all of you. So don't worry about that. We have more than 1 hour. We have 1 hour, so we can discuss. So now, Gary, please turn your microphone on.
There we go.
Good.
So here's the thing. I didn't intend to raise my hand.
Sorry. So it was done by mistake.
Now that I've been recognized, I would say that I thought it was so helpful to me to hear this presentation and to get this understanding from the point of view of a philosophical point of view. And of course, I'm a clinical psychologist, so I immediately begin to think of this in terms of the clinical experience and the relationship that occurs in the treatment situation. And I have two thoughts. One is that basic empathy, the idea here, to me, really speaks to the individual differences we bring to the situation, the capacity. And it made me think of how in dialectical behavior therapy, we really emphasize the power of presence and the development of a mindfulness practice. And I think that enhances the capacity to be with the patient and be open to the reciprocity and the mutuality. So I think that's an important idea there. And I think with respect to the mutuality, I think the other idea that occurred to me is when we think of empathy, it's not just understanding these ideas underpinning it, but also the power therapeutically to communicate understanding. And I think that when you think of mutuality, the capacity to communicate understanding to another actually probably enhances the other's capacity to be understood because it changes the communication. So the music creates a dance of reciprocal understanding that I think deepens the empathetic experience, hopefully to the benefit of the patient in the clinical situation. So those were the ideas, and I need to learn how to use this software better so I don't have that happen.
We have time, Gary, don't worry. We have time until June, so we have lots of other events. You will succeed. So, Shaun, you want to reply?
Sure. Just thanks for the observations, and yeah, I think it's important for psychotherapists even to think about the embodiment that's sort of in the clinic or in the therapeutic session, and what body language, I think they might think of it in terms of body language, what their body language is like, and how it in a certain way generates a kind of meaning that is not always under either of the individual's control, but somehow or other maybe can affect something, a cure or whatever. In any case, I think it's an important kind of thing to think about. Yes, I agree. Thanks, Gary.
Thank you very much, Gary, once again. So now we have Vittorio, Dan, and then Lambros, our three of our founding members. So Vittorio.
Yes, first of all, thank you so much, Shaun, for this incredible, brave new talk. Brave because you are brave enough to provide us with an incredibly insightful synthesis of this incredibly confused field. Since from an historical point of view, and the fact that Trevarthen posed a view of basic empathy, I'm very much sympathetic with, by using the original term by Smith, which is sympathy, which automatically introduces things that Trevarthen himself does not allow to be part of his definition of sympathy/empathy, makes it clear that this is a bloody, confused turf. So thank you for your bringing us through these very crucial elements of intersubjectivity, and as Claudio said, are right at the heart of the major goals of the center. So one point is the following. I'm totally with you in challenging the idea that proto-conversations already bear an interesting full-blown narrative quality. I think you're right in challenging this point. I think you mentioned a couple of times a keyword here, scaling up. So, but I disagree with you when you point out that the inactive quality displayed by neonates and infants is the quality of basic empathy. I think that characterizes a time window of our physical and cognitive development when you really, also because of lack of enough inhibitory control, just because of your brain maturation, you reenact, you imitate, you mimic, you are contagious, and so much so on. We turn that into something which is more and more just inner. Inner means not introspectively, inner in the sense of the mechanism that simulates to the extent that doesn't lead necessarily to a contagion. So I challenge the phenomenological critic moved by Dan Zahavi and others that resonance means contagion. That's not true. That stems from a poor master of the nuts and bolts of the very complicated neurophysiological mechanism. So my question to you is the following. Why do we need to keep separate the dimension of simulation and perception or basic understanding? I think we are using different levels of description. Simulation is the functional level, while perception or understanding, direct understanding, is what transpires at the level of the experience. Second question, why higher order empathy should be qualified as empathy? Why do we need to double empathy? What you're referring to, beside the confused notion of higher order empathy that you quoted, the affective main quality, the caring dimension, which is sympathy, is not empathy, but let alone this confusion introduced in this definition. Why do we need a second empathy? Why are not we happy with the basic level and what you tentatively define as a higher order empathy? We leave it for the proper narrative level of mutual understanding. Sorry, it was so rich. I was too long. So, thanks.
Okay. Good. Thank you, Vittorio. I know we've been discussing this for a long time. So first of all, I should say I like the word resonance. It's not something I would reject out of hand. But then on each of these points, it's a question of how do we understand this? What does resonance mean? Now, at least on some accounts, resonance is sort of looked upon as simply a brain resonating, some kind of neural resonance. And I think what Trevarthen is proposing is that if we use the term resonance, it's more a resonance between bodies, between a kind of intersubjective resonance that involves timing, emotional expression. He's doing a lot of studies looking at the videotapes and doing very fine-tuned analyses and seeing a kind of back and forth resonance there. And this is something that takes place in the full body. My whole body is resonating, not just some neurons firing in my brain. So depending on how we define resonance, that's one thing. I think also this goes to the question of how should we understand things at the functional level, right? Where then it's a question of how do we define the terms of, say, simulation versus a kind of sensory motor process that is perceptual in nature? And can we make a distinction? Is there a distinction to be made there? And again, looking at how we define things, if we define things in terms of matching or this kind of isomorphic principle, that seems different from a more enactive which is not necessarily the idea of me imitating or matching what I see, but rather engaging with it and doing things that are complementary, and that where mirror neurons may in fact be part of the future-oriented, preparation for my action, rather than the backward looking at what's just happened in the other person. That's Pierre Jacob's point, by the way, but I kind of am on board with that.
I would introduce a caveat. Never equate the neuroscientific functional level of description with isomorphism. Isomorphism, I would dare to say, doesn't exist in the brain.
Okay.
Even in mirror neurons.
Yeah, but Rizzolatti, and I think at some point you were on board with the idea of the matching hypothesis. So that matching, isn't that an isomorphic kind of claim?
Well, it depends what is getting matched, of course.
Yeah. There are a couple of variations of how we understand that. Yeah. So let me acknowledge that these are issues that depend to some extent on how we're understanding some of the concepts, and in some cases we might be closer than we think we are, and in other cases, yeah, I'm going to try to insist on at least trying to get clear about what we mean by these concepts. Yeah, I don't think we're going to settle it today, but it's an ongoing. I love talking with Vittorio about this stuff, but trying to get a resolution is very difficult, I think.
So thank you very much, Vittorio. Thank you very much, Shaun, and thank you very much, Dan, for waking up so early. What time is it in Australia?
It's now. It's now 5:22. But
so thank you so much for being here.
This ship set sail much earlier. So either it's because I'm sleepy, or because Shaun did a great job. I think I really agree with almost everything this time, Shaun. Maybe you have me. This is the right time to have me involved in a debate. So, well, certainly, I think that I was pleased to see your take on in response to making sure that the narrative doesn't fall into pan-narrativism, which we've discussed before. I think that's an important point, and maybe we'll have argument here around that. I think that the properties, that even if they're not more than loosely defined, but a criterion perhaps for what counts as a narrative, I do think that following Herman and others, we need something more robust than just that it shares some structural properties with the more musical engagements that we might find. They can have a rhythm, they can have all those features, and that sounds good. There's a couple of questions, there's only a couple of things that I wanted to note or make comment on. One was, and it's funny, am I sympathizing or empathizing with Vittorio? But I mean, the one thing that I relates is the talk about isomorphism when we're talking about intentionality. It seems like what we want to say is that at the very minimum, there's a co-targeting there, right? I'm not actually just sure what it would mean. I know the move you were making. You were saying the one focuses on the phenomenology and the other focuses on the intentionality, and I agree with that. But I think that it might be better to talk therein about co-targeting rather than having an isomorphic intentionality. I don't know how to make sense of that exactly, what it would mean. So I think that just as a technical point, I think that would secure, a notion that we can co-attend, that we can, and that we can attend in different ways. So that it allows for that scope of developing and perhaps coming to some kind of mutual engagement or mutual understanding, rather than something that being a precondition for being able to engage in empathetic or sympathetic relations. And the other one, I suppose, I do agree with Vittorio. I mean, I would just, again, technically just maybe avoid the language of higher order. what I think is we can distinguish, and here I do think we can make a difference. We can distinguish empathetic acts that involve narration, perhaps even content, in my terms, right? And I think we should do that. But I think they're still continuous with the other acts in some important respect. And I wouldn't think of them as higher order, right? A higher order literally just means they're technically, taking the thing and placing it in a different relation, where I think that language is not the best language for capturing the idea that you're in a kind of continuing developing stream and you get extra capacities, right? Those capacities then change your ability to make sense of people, right? You're now doing it in a new way, but that's still moving along a single track. It's not going into some kind of different type of empathy in the stronger sense. And this is something I've always had to dance around with respect to wanting to make those distinctions. So those are the only two comments at this sleepy hour that I can pull out.
Okay. Well, good. Thanks. Let me say I actually agree with you on the higher order issue. I don't like this kind of hierarchical, top-down, bottom-up type stuff. I was borrowing it, I suppose, from the discussion. Goldman uses it. So I think maybe more complex might be a way to put it. Well,
I would just why not just say narrative involving or narratively based, or something like that, because that seemed to be the real property that would differentiate it.
Yeah. But the debate is about whatever that is, and not everybody agrees it's narratively based. So I need some kind of term there. So maybe more complex would work it. And also you sent me back to a point that Vittorio raised and I didn't answer. Why do we need this to talk about this more complex type of thing as empathy or whatever? And there is just a kind of ordinary everyday understanding of what empathy is that is not captured in the original discussion back in the early 20th century, and that is something like empathy is not just immediately resonating, because sometimes it might take some effort to empathize with someone. You have to understand their situation in order to really get it, perhaps. And the immediacy of dyadic or primary intersubjective relations that's one thing, but this type of more complex attempt to gain an understanding and to really understand what's going on with someone, and then to empathize, that seems to me to be still more complex, something different. We can get rid of the term higher order. And I think maybe you're also right about the isomorphic, right? That was just since I was engaging, basically with the simulationist account. This is their principle, which is they're talking, but they talk about sharing, so maybe it's more like sharing. They call it a similarity type of thing that they're talking about, but that seems too close to the isomorphism idea. So there are, we can definitely juggle some of the terms here and try to get a cleaner account. Thanks, Dan.
Thank you very much. Then, Lambros.
Yes. Hello, Shaun. Thank you very much for the talk. My question, I guess, has to do more with the last part of your talk and the points you're raising about narrative and language and relationship with stories and the action basis of that. I would like to hear more about and perhaps some clarifications on how you see the relationship between language and narrative. And my interest is not so much from a developmental perspective, but more from an evolutionary perspective. Meaning what I'm trying to say is I would see empathy coming very early in the human story, perhaps at the stage where language is not fully developed. yet, and I wonder how you see the link between narrative and language, and to what extent you would consider a fully developed language as a precondition for narrative proper, or whether we could perhaps think of narrative as something more action-based, perhaps enacted, performed, and having also other elements that we could see earlier in the process of evolution.
Mm.
Yeah, that's my basic question, and together with that second point, to what extent you see anything by way of culture specificity? Meaning, are we talking about universal processes, or are we expecting that there might be differences depending on specific cultural or perhaps also social situations?
Okay, great questions. That probably will take me a little bit beyond where I'm prepared to go, but if you say that empathy is very early developing and perhaps pre-linguistic, that still works for basic empathy. I mean, if we want to think about empathy in terms of basic empathy, that can be. I mean, and if we think of it. Well, if we think of it in almost any of the various theories of basic empathy, it can be very much pre-linguistic. Even Trevarthen's narrative idea is pre-linguistic for him. Narrative is not necessarily linguistic. I tend to think of language narrative involving language. More so than it being pre-linguistic. But then I also want to define language very widely, so that in certain contexts, gestures are definitely part of language, and communicative processes are on from the beginning, but they're pre-linguistic. Proto-conversations, or whatever we want to say. This is part of the developmental story again. But it's a good question about the evolutionary part of it. But I don't know if what you think about the idea that there could be empathy without language. I think I agree with that, but that's what I would call basic empathy. Can I then, without language, get a full-fledged understanding of the other person's situation? And I think, yeah, well, I could imagine. So if one allows for imagination, but certainly narrative helps me, language helps me to imagine things that otherwise I might not be able to imagine. So I think language, again, is important. Cross-culturally, I think that you find you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you find stories in every culture, and children being told stories, and at least in the Western cultures that I'm familiar with, we start reading stories to children, infants before they're born, sometimes. So Merleau-Ponty has said, we're born into a web of language. Now, language is there from the very beginning. So language is not just language acquisition at 2 years old, but we're in this kind of web of language. And they're hearing stories, and they're hearing, right? Now, it takes a while for them to gain, I think, what we're calling narrative competency. And that comes along, I think, with the development of language. But it's not like a, night and day, black and white type of transition. It's something that emerges from this kind of web of language that they've been born into. So I want to take language to be a very kind of wide concept, that narrative kind of comes to develop within that. I can't say too much about the evolutionary story at this point, but that's probably as best I can do.
Yeah, no, thank you, Shaun. And I don't think there is an easy answer there. But coming back to the point, if I may, about the cross-cultural aspect of all this. I mean, I guess what I was really after was to thinking in terms of this embodied intersubjectivity, where the actual bodily interaction is that matter. This is something that we will see happening in different ways in different social and cultural contexts. So if we are to argue that we take that bodily action seriously, that it really matters, that for me means that we have different varieties of intersubjectivity and perhaps also of empathy or narrative or whatever we think it ties and it's grounded on that. And which is a very interesting proposition, to which I definitely actually think I would agree with. I just want to make that more explicit and see how far are we willing to go with this kind of argument.
Yeah. So Philippe Rochat, who's a developmental psychologist, has done a lot of cross-cultural studies of just these types of interactions dyadic interactions between mother and child across different cultures. And I think what's right is that, well, it differs from one culture to another. Yeah? And the difference is oftentimes a difference in sort of the arrangement of bodies. You know, whether you carry your child on your back or on your front, around with, whether you carry them around with you at all. And that kind of thing, and what you're doing and what you're sharing with them. It does differ, but nonetheless, the common thread is that it's about interaction. That this is always the case. But that there are variations within that, and therefore, as you suggest, maybe variations in what we would take to be empathy or even narrative. That probably is right.
Thank you, Shaun.
Thanks, Lambros.
Thank you, Lambros. Thank you once again, Shaun. We have several questions from the audience, so I'm going to. Okay, Luigi already did that, so I think we have Stavros. Just turn your microphone on.
Hello. Thanks for the fascinating talk and also the fantastic initiative. I saw it on Facebook of all places, and I was really pleased. So I really liked the direction Lambros was pushing in, and so my question also pertains to sort of cross-culture. So if I'm, getting out of depth and someone can correct me, please do. So in certain situations, cross-cultures, and by cross-cultures, I don't mean, mother-infant dyadic interactions and then compare those across cultures. I mean, when cross-cultural interactions, so two people from different cultures interact, empathy may break down because maybe the neural machinery associated with the emotion is the same, but the intentionality, as you mentioned earlier on the phenomenological account, might differ. So it might, in some cultures, it might make sense to feel shame in a certain situation, but it isn't the norm in another culture. So with going on that, you sort of, for the first time, Trevarthen's idea of having this sort of like rhythmic pattern or narrative. I know on your account it is a narrative, but let's call it this sort of rhythmic pattern. Could that also prevent cross-cultural empathy because even if the intentionality is the same, the rhythm is just different and it just doesn't make sense. In the same way that if in some cultures, say in sort of Romani gypsy music, it might sound sad to us, whereas to them it's a jubilant song. And I was wondering what you can say about that.
I think that's right. That it can break down. That empathy is threatened if there is, if this kind of basic empathy at least is threatened if there is this kind of perhaps disruption of rhythm. And you don't have to go cross-culturally even. You can find this even within your own culture when you are engaged with maybe someone who has a condition that is quite used to. This might be So Jonathan Cole, for example, writes about Mobius syndrome, which is like a paralysis of the face. They don't have regular facial gestures, and it's very difficult just to sometimes to look at the face of the other, but also to engage with them in a kind of normal, rhythmic way. And you might find this in a number of different types of conditions, but certainly cross-culturally, it can happen as well. There's just maybe a different rhythm. That's kind of on basic empathy. There are some experiments by forget his first name, Slovic is the last name, on altruistic behavior, which is related, I think, to empathy, where he shows that if you just give someone a set of statistics and ask them to donate because of all the starvation in some country, they will give something, but they give much more if you present them with a narrative and maybe even a photograph of one person in trouble and a narrative about that person's situation. Then they give more money. They're more proactively altruistic, which I think is telling in some sense, because it says the more we it's difficult perhaps even to understand someone from a different culture unless you are familiar with their narrative, and maybe even in a face-to-face kind of relationship that is not disruptive with respect to this kind of musicality or rhythm that Trevarthen talks about. So there are a number of ways that I think empathy could be disrupted, either basic or higher, more complex. I think that's right. I think it's a good question.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah.
John?
Great. Thank you, Professor Gallagher, for that amazing lecture. You spoke briefly about third-person narratives and actors and film media, and I wondered if I could ask a little bit about the connection between enactivism and perceptual theory to film. It seems like the enactivist approach is kind of grounded in Heidegger's distinction between interpretation and understanding, where in order to understand the other and not just interpret them, I need to be ready for some kind of contextual interaction, some kind of situational comportment. And of course, in filmed media, there's kind of all of like a simulation of gestures, intentions, expressions, and so on. Perhaps there's some mirror neuron response, but my ability for dynamic coupling or my ability for interaction is cut off. So I have the perception of somebody's expression and their action, but I have no ability to interact. So I wondered if it would even be possible, or if we should try to develop an enactivist or a direct perceptual reading of those kinds of media. And then maybe an interesting contrast case to that would be text and email communication. So not video calls, but when we speak with somebody on email or writing, so there's no action space, there's no embodied resonance, there's maybe not any contagion, but there is still an interaction with a live person, but without usually the cues that we might rely on. So I wondered if we should, or it would be possible to make an activist and direct perceptual account of those kinds of interaction.
Great question. I've done some work. My daughter is an actor, and we've done some work on empathy in acting, but it's from the perspective of the performer rather than from the perspective of the audience. So the question is, can the actor empathize with their character? And it's a very interesting kind of question, I think. And the answer is it depends on the acting style or school of acting that you follow, and so forth. So that gets complicated. I haven't done as much from the audience perspective, but I think of this in terms of a lot of the theory of mind discussion, which oftentimes starts from an observational perspective. So when I observe the other person and I'm trying to read their mind, I think that's quite a different perspective from the what we might call the participatory perspective, where we are engaged with the other person in a kind of intersubjective interaction. So if we distinguish those two, we can ask which is primary, so to speak. And I would say it's the interaction that's primary, and we learn as infants and as children and throughout our lives, we're interacting with others, and this is where we learn where we get our intersubjective capacities. Those same things might be, so to speak, informing observational type perspectives. So if I'm sitting, in the theater watching a film, and I see all this action, it's not that I'm just merely intellectually understanding it, but I can become engaged, and I can enter into the other person's world in a certain way. Now, it might be that Vittorio would want to chime in here because he's thought about this a lot more than I have. But I would say that the kind of perception I have of the action in the film action, can be considered a kind of enactive perception. It can involve mirror neurons and all of that, but it's something like perceiving in terms of how I would operate, how I might engage with that person or that character if I were able to, rather than simply, I would say simply simulating or matching what the action is in order to understand it somehow. But that would be my take on it. Text, of course, we can read novels, and I think there's a lot of good neuroscientific story about all of that. But again, it's about understanding what exactly is how well. Yeah, it's a big conversation that I can't really answer in a very short way. But it's about understanding how the brain operates and what it means when this set of neurons, when they're firing, when they're active, even when I'm reading a text or a novel or something like that, and somehow or other there's an emotional response. So there has been some studies at Stanford. I don't know what the status of those studies are, but I think it's called the Jane Austen Project, where there's some looking at brain processes when you're reading Jane Austen, and it turns out that it seems like the whole brain is involved. Everything is kind of active. And I would say probably your body, right? And there are bodily processes that are also engaged, not just brain processes. So I think it's a fully embodied type of thing that we could talk about, and then different degrees of that. Jane Austen is one thing, but if you're reading a philosophy paper, maybe not.
Great, thank you very much, Professor Gallagher. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, John. So we have Susanna now.
Okay. Let me see. Hello, Shaun.
Hi, Suzanne.
Nice to see you face to face.
Yeah.
So I want to ask you a question about the main idea, I guess the core idea, which is that empathy is embodied in the movement and the intersubjective interactions. And you know that I'm on board 100% with that idea. So I was wondering if you could provide like a first pass answer to the question, how do we explain lack of empathy in some pathological cases, let's say? And I was thinking about kind of 3 possible ways within your framework you could target this, and I was wondering what your opinion would be. So you could say, of course, that there's a problem with, they have a problem with primary intersubjectivity, right? That's it. But still, it feels like even this, I know, psychopath has a history of bodily movement and sensory motor experiences. So there's going to be something else that we will need to bring here. So maybe it has to do with the fact that empathy is intersubjective. It's a relational phenomenon. You could say there's a lack of empathy in our interaction here. It's not the problem with this one person. But even then, it's kind of hard not to appropriate to the individual their lack of ability to empathize if it's consistently the same individual that has the problematic relationships, right, with other people. So maybe it's a higher order problem. Is it a problem with an imagination or not being properly integrated in some narratives? Even though those integrations also come down to embodiment, as you explained in the last part of your talk. So I was wondering if it's any of those roots are appealing as a first pass answer. There's a fourth answer I'm missing. Thanks. Yeah, thanks in advance.
Okay. Okay, good. Well, some people think that even a sociopath can feel empathy. And in fact, if someone is torturing another person, it might be that empathy is useful because they can understand when the other person is in pain or not. But you know, more generally speaking, we tend to think of sociopaths as not being empathic, for example, and I think that's something to investigate, maybe. But I guess one thing I would say, to be clear, is that just because I'm an enactivist doesn't mean that I think that the brain has nothing to do with it. Right? I think the brain is part of the body, that a lot of things circuit back into and forward and back through the brain. It's part of a circuit that has to be closed. You know, whatever is going on in the brain is part of the story. And if there is damage in the brain, if the frontal cortex is somehow or other not exactly normal, then just there might be a kind of sudden block, a sudden disconnect, a way to explain how the circuit is broken, just in that kind of neurological type of perspective. So that can have an effect upon the body. I think, you know, we've been working on a little bit on autism, you know, and there's a lot of movement problems involved in autism. So it's not just that theory of mind mechanism is broken, but it has to do with different kinds of movement in terms of the autistic individual. I don't know what to say about that specific point when it comes to sociopaths, but definitely we have to bring the brain into it. We have to understand how the brain works within this whole system, and that something going wrong in the neurology can also have an effect on the body and our intersubjective interactions.
Thank you. We have Paolo now, and then the last question. Paolo, please turn your microphone on. We cannot hear you.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
No.
I can hear you, but it's somehow or other distorted.
Somebody's not a cat.
I think we can just move to the next question, because I think that there were some problems on that. So, Edward?
Hi, can you all hear me? It says I'm muting. Hello.
Hi, I hear you.
Fine.
All right, cool. Thank you very much, Shaun, and thank you for all of you for putting this on. Great presentation. I look forward to future presentations as well. I have a lot of questions, but I'll put most of them aside. Maybe we can talk about that later. Right now, I'm curious about the role of an imagination in this whole thing. So I'm wondering if an imagination is meant to answer the diversity objection, and to what extent that it succeeds. So the objection, as I understand it, refers to the fact that the other person's possibilities, their experience, their mental states, motivations, even interpretations of their situation and so on, those outstrip my own possibilities. That is, I'm really only understanding myself as if, and then fill in whatever details you need, and not really understanding the other. Now, narrative seemingly can, of course, enhance my ability to conceive of various possibilities, but it still seems that the other may outstrip those possibilities as well, and that at bottom, an imagination still provides only an understanding of how somebody who is not me would act in such and such a situation, insofar as the narrative is understood or interpreted by me, right? Insofar as I sort of already interpret and incorporate that narrative and those narrative possibilities. And then additionally, if an imagination is supposed to line up with the Trevarthen account, I'm just wondering if it's meant to be a kind of relational thing, because it still sounds somewhat individualistic to me if I'm sort of expanding my horizons through film and novels and things like this, and then understanding somebody else in reference to what I already understand.
Yeah, good question. Well, in some sense, you're right. It has to do with enhancing my imagination. So an imagination is a kind of an enhanced by the wealth of narratives that I might have access to, the different narratives that I've been raised on and that I might encounter in all kinds of different artistic expressions and so forth and so on. So it is about an enhancement of sorts. And it could include, it's not just generalized narrative, it could include the narratives of the other person. I could know this person and I could know their story, and that helps me to understand, where they're coming from and what they're doing and what they're thinking, perhaps. So it doesn't have to be impersonal narratives. It could be, directly about this person. And I would say also that, two other things. One is that it's right. It's not that I'm making a claim that our understanding is perfect when we have those narratives. In fact, our understanding of others is not perfect. Hardly ever, maybe, is it perfect. So there's a lot of misunderstanding too, and it might be that some of these narratives will generate misunderstandings as well. And then it's a matter of give and take, conversation, getting the story straight, and so forth and so on. So it's not a claim that, oh, this solves all problems or anything like that. And finally, the point about, in some senses, here's a narrative and it's my interpretation of the narrative, so it still seems somewhat isolated or individualistic. But in fact, I think the bigger story is that we get those narratives from others. We don't invent them ourselves. We get them from others. They're the stories of others. They're the stories that are given to us by others. And the way that we interpret the stories, the categories we might use for the interpretation are given to us by others. It's not that we are making them up as we go. It's rather, these are things I've inherited from other people. So it seems to me that there's intersubjectivity all over the place here, in the interpretation, in the narratives. It is a social type of phenomenon, and the claim that it's an individualistic is total, to me, total kind of abstraction.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Ed.
Thank you, Edward. Thank you, Shaun. Let's try again with Paolo. If we can hear him.
Hello.
Okay, now it's good.
Good.
Thank you. So I would like to thank so much Shaun and all the contribution I heard, and I just wanted to, I would like to give just a reflection in the role of a musician. You said musician first, and I rediscovered what a musician experiences with little awareness, and when a musician improvises, and alone as a reflexive act. I would say, but you can comment on this, please. This is the basic empathy side of the process, and like an infant who explores her body and her space, and then with others as an act that becomes a narrative of a higher order, experiencing different perspectives coming from rehearsals, court, cultural and social practices, and so on. And so the group can scale up into an artistic form and can generate meaning in the horizon of in a state of a collective empathy. This is what I feel from the perspective of doing music, I mean, not from the perspective of being a scholar or a professor at the University of Trieste. And in the light of this, I would ask, in this time of the pandemic and post-pandemic time, we need empathy. But could we imagine, or in other words, can empathy be a learning process? Can we organize empathy? Very frequently, we talk about organizing improvisation in business, in the management practice, leadership, the servant leadership, the spiritual leadership, and so on. But I think that your message, I would be very, very pleased to be an evangelist of your approach in the light of the post-pandemic next or new normal environment we will be dealing with. Thank you. Thank you so much, Shaun.
Okay. Thank you, Paulo. Great questions. Well, the question about can you educate empathy? I think, in fact, yeah, people have studied this, and indeed, one way to think about that is, again, through a kind of education of by narratives or in narratives. That might be the more complex kind of empathy, but in fact, what I'm suggesting is that there's a kind of relationship between the more complex and the more basic. So even the more we learn about life and about others and about different cultures and so forth, that can fine-tune perhaps our basic type of empathy as well as the more complex kind. Your description of scaling up to a kind of collective empathy, I think that's very interesting. And one can, I think, yeah, very nicely, one can think of that in terms of musical improvisation. That's still, to me, at least in terms of, although it's definitely, okay, so there's two points. I would think that that kind of sense that one might experience as they are engaged in that kind of performance, and thinking of it in terms of, playing music with others, is still a kind of basic empathy, it seems to me, right? Something very bodily, very much part of the engagement with the other person. That it can be collective and still basic in that sense. There was another point I wanted to make on that, and that is that I thought you were going to ask at first something about, consciousness, or how much do we need to be conscious of the empathic, and basically, yeah. I don't think that is a problem there. It can be unconscious. A lot of these processes are non-conscious, and I think there was something else I was going to say. Now I can't think of it, but I don't know if you're familiar with Simon Hofting's analysis. It's a phenomenological analysis of playing music together. And he talks quite a bit about this type of thing too. So it's quite a good study, I think.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Paolo. Thank you, Shaun. So we are done with the questions from the audience. So just a couple of words of reaction, Shaun. I really loved your relationalist account of empathy in some way. That was, to me, a great idea. And a couple of remarks. The first one, I think that the main, of course, in order to use his own terminology, I'm much more sympathetic with Trevarthen's idea of a narrative structure or of primary intersubjectivity in some way. But still, I think that the main point of, questioning is if we agree in thinking that narrative as a representative structure in some way. To me, from an activist point of view, which is, usually anti-representationalist, this idea of, of keeping narrative as a representational artifact is still something that I can't buy in some way, because, of course, it's also the common sense, the common view that narrative represents the action. But I think, and I want to know what you think about it, if we introduce, as you did, a third term, which is a key term, this meaning is some way something that can mediate between the two. So I would not buy the idea that narrative represents action. I would say that narrative shape in some way action, but they don't. But this does not imply to buy an idea of pan-narrativity in some way, because the way narrative shape action is through meaning. If you have a semiotic idea of narrative in some way, or narrativity, semiotician thinks that meaning as a narrative form. Think about frame semantics. If we build up a semantics, a cognitive semantics, think about the frame semantics, all the Tenier stuffs about structural syntaxis. The idea is that when we develop meaning in some way, we have a kind of a narrative framing the structure of meaning. So that's how we did it. I would say that meaning can do the job in some way for mediating between the two. The second remark, the second reaction as a semiotician, I would say, of course, the musical structure that Trevarthen, teaches us, which is great also for explaining all the work, the extraordinary work he's doing with primary intersubjectivity. I don't think it. As a semiotician, I don't think it overlaps the 4 steps of narrativity. For instance, if I take the competence phase, I think that you can find all the 4 movements of Trevarthen's idea of music, of interaction inside the acquiring of a competence in order to perform an action in some way. So you will have a climax, you will have a resolution. If you take the sanction, you also have that. So that's a great idea. So it was an idea to write the paper, but I don't think that. I think that the two can be put together without overlapping in some way.
Okay, thanks, Claudio. I'm not sure I can address this last point. I think maybe you just might be right about musicality and how it might fit into the narrative framework. But going back to the question of meaning, I mean, I agree with you. I mean, the enactivists would say meaning emerges out of these kind of actions and interactions with others. It's possible then to also say that in some way narrative shapes action, but that, to me, that's like a looping effect. That's like, once we have the narrative, of course, it sort of informs our actions, and we maybe find ourselves doing what we're doing because we have a certain story in our head, because we have a certain plan that we could put in terms of narrative. So it's not that I'm trying to pull these apart and saying, these are this representation is just an external, grabbing of the action. I think there is a kind of representative function that narratives play, and they reflect the structure of the action itself in some way, which has a beginning and a middle and an end and so forth. But to the idea that narrative shapes the action, I think, well, that's just, yeah, this kind of looping back, and I think that's perfectly fine. That's perfectly okay. But the claim, Trevarthen's claim seems to be, and maybe your claim is, that movement, action has an intrinsic narrative structure, and that's I guess what I'm disagreeing with, and that's, it seems to me, leads to saying everything is a narrative, which then, it means nothing. It's too trivial. So yeah, I'm not quite sure. I think, I know we disagree on this, but I think there's a way to say that narrative can shape action. That's for sure. But I would still want to argue that that action is not intrinsically narratival or has a narrative structure. It has a structure that then narrative inherits. But okay. So I think we're clear how we disagree.
How we disagree. But thank you so much once again, Shaun, for the wonderful presentation, to all the audience and to all our members of the center for, I think, the gorgeous discussion, and having the possibility to hear you, Dan, Vittorio, and Lambros discussing this kind of topics. I think it's a great emotion for us. Also, I think we are going into the right direction in building an idea like that and putting us together to discuss. So I just want to, thank you. I just want to tell everybody that one of the aim of this international centers is also to keep you updated with the books and the publications that are going out connected to enactivism and cognitive semiotics. So it's not a commercial, but Shaun's books about action and interaction, but we don't want to make presentation of the books. We simply want to, tell you that they are out in some way, and we want to discuss the idea as Shaun did it with his own presentation. So this is the book by Shaun that is just came out, and we do the very same thing with other books from the International Center. We have the books by Lambros Malafouris and Mariadana Cucuti on mirror gazing, my book about cognitive semiotics, Fausto's books about habits, but we won't make presentation, we just have talks and then discuss them. But I think that it's also important to keep you updated of the news coming from Enactivism and Cognitive Semiotics. So I thank you once again for being here. Thank you, Shaun, for the wonderful presentation. So, and see you in a couple of weeks, the 1st of March, with Catherine Legg, that will give us a talk about the founder of cognitive semiotics, that is Charles Sanders Peirce, who is also the founder of pragmatism, which is one of the main sources of enactivism. So I think that Catherine will make a wonderful job in showing us the connection between pragmatism and cognitive semiotics and enactivism. So see you in a couple of weeks, and thank you once again for being here, more than 100, so I think it's a huge success and we can be happy for that. So thank you once again.
Thanks for everyone hanging in there.
Bye.
Ciao Lambros, ciao Cisco. Hi everybody. And thanks to Luigi's work of building up the technicalities.
Okay, thank you. Yes.